Kia ora koutou katoa, everyone. Welcome to the Te Pita Ora NZILA Streetscape webinar. Today we're really excited to have Chris Reed and Mike Belleme joining us from the east coast of the USA. They'll be exploring the theatre of urban landscapes today. This will be an immersive exploration of the social lives of urban landscapes, the actors and actions that compose the daily theatre of urban life. Before we begin, I'd just like to thank our sponsor Streetscape, who are sponsoring these webinars. This is the fourth in this series, and we've got more coming up soon. By now, you'll hopefully know that Streetscape work nationwide, from Rotorua, Redwoods to the Christchurch Airport, with projects all over New Zealand. So do go check out their website, and don't forget to mention the webinar series when you're chatting about your next street furniture project, as we we like to support those that support us. And so we're just going to start with a brief video from Streetscape.
Streetscape is New Zealand's leading manufacturer of quality street furniture, lighting poles, shelters, and sculptures that breathe life into our open space environments. Collaborating with landscape architects and designers to share our manufacturing expertise and experience, we create solutions to meet your design brief, your budget, and your project delivery deadline. At Streetscape, we have a great range of off-the-shelf furniture. Together, we can modify and customize our existing ranges to suit, or we can provide the design support to manufacture fully bespoke furniture for your project. With all furniture proudly manufactured in New Zealand from locally and ethically sourced materials, and with over 100 years of combined experience, you can be sure of the craftsmanship. Quality products made to withstand our unique environmental conditions while meeting all local health and safety standards. Local doesn't just mean local knowledge and local jobs. It also means reduced lead times and a local team who manage every step of the way with you to see the project from your concept through to final delivery. Aotearoa, New Zealand, these are our places, our communities, our environments, and we want you to enjoy them the way you imagine them. That's why we go that extra mile every time. Streetscape, turning your imagination into reality. Streetscape, in conjunction with the NZILA, are proud to sponsor the Streetscape Speaker Series.
Thanks again to Streetscape for supporting this, this series. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. One of my favourite landscape architects, Chris Reed, the Founding Director of Stoss, internationally recognised as a leading voice in the transformation of landscapes and cities. He works alternately as a researcher, a strategist, a teacher, a designer and an advisor. He was the recipient of the 2012 Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award in Landscape Architecture. Chris is a professor of landscape architecture at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design. And joining Chris today is Mike Belleme, a self-taught Appalachian-born documentary photographer living in North Carolina. Mike's work intimately examines themes of connection and community and the physical, mental and social constructs that cultivate and inhibit connection. At the heart of this is a considered approach to contemporary issues that help us explore the seen and the unseen forces that dictate how we perceive each other and the world around us. Mike's work can be seen in such publications as the New York Times, Rolling Stone, Time, The Guardian, National Geographic, and many more. His first book, Mise-en-Scène, is a collaboration with Chris and explores the implications of design at a variety of scales in urban life and ecology. So with great pleasure, over to you, Chris and Mike.
Great, Henry, thank you so much. Pleasure to be with you. Thanks to you and Helen for the hospitality, and hello to everybody. It's so nice to be with you. Hey, Mike.
Hey, thanks everyone for having us.
Mike's in an Airstream trailer in the woods of Maine, and I'm very jealous right now. I had the pleasure of joining you all a few years back. Henry reminded me that it was 2008 when I was last down there. I hope to get back to see you again soon, but in the meantime, we thought we'd share some of our latest work in collaboration with you, and it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm gonna share screen and see if our technology is working today. And we'll dive right in as I go to full screen. Mike, are we good there? Great, excellent. All right, well, thanks everybody. To begin very broadly, the tensions between societal, racial, and environmental advancement and retreat, the battle for the hearts and minds of people, the battle for the planet, continue to play out in so many of today's public discussions around urbanization, new development, open space, the impacts of climate change, and planning and design strategies in cities. Mise-en-Scène is a project about the diverse and complex issues that shape and impact contemporary urban landscapes and cities, and by extension, urban and landscape practices. Mise-en-Scène is a project about the lives and afterlives of cities and landscapes and the people who inhabit them, both the actors on stage and the urban, social, political, cultural, and environmental contexts in which they exist. It's a conversation about what we as designers encounter in our everyday work lives, and in many ways, how we channel the diverse voices, lenses, perspectives, and currents to inform our work and to inform the bigger project of city making. The project's very much a project of reflection and curation. Reflection in that we're taking stock of the moment pre-pandemic and a bit during the pandemic, asking questions. What are the issues in play in contemporary cities? What is the state of public and urban affairs, environmentally, socially, culturally, urbanistically? What is common and what is unique to each of these places? As a public realm practice, what are and have been the starting points for our work? What are the currents we draw on, the acts and actors in progress? In this way, the lives and situations depicted in the photographs set the stage for the work we do in cities, just as our designs and projects set up new or altered conditions that themselves prompt new responses, new actions, new dynamics, new scenes that continue to play out long after we leave. It's also a project of curation. In the same way that we are not single actors in the places we work, the book is an assemblage of lenses, voices, perspectives that are intended to paint a multivariate picture, to offer competing, complex, and contradictory standpoints, to stand along one another as an assemblage of things, and hopefully to reverberate creatively off one another. It's modeled a bit after an art book as a collection or scrapbook of pieces that allow for multiple entry points and multiple readings depending where and when you start. It's one that asks questions and sets up prompts without attempting to tie a neat bow on the messiness and richness that is contemporary life. It's also not a monograph, and it's not particularly aimed at an inside audience. It's intended to speak to a broader set of publics, especially those interested in photographies and cities and design most broadly. And here it's important to communicate then with words and images that resonate with a non-academic audience, one that extends far beyond the designers that we usually talk to, though we're absolutely happy to be in your company. It's also a project that extends from various lineages of landscape. And I will say right up front, this is a project that really focuses on the American, the US context and the North American continent. But we're hoping there are insights here that are applicable around the world. From a landscape perspective, we recognize the lineage established by Ansel Adams so long ago in his efforts to bring the wonders of what became the American national parks to a broader audience. We also acknowledge the work that folks like Ed Bertinsky did to paint a different picture of the realities of human consumption and the kind of landscape residue, the poisoned landscape residues that we sometimes leave behind. And we also look to the work of folks like Alex McLean, who has made his career around depicting various elements of the American landscape from the air. More importantly, perhaps, we draw on documentary photography, photojournalism, and photography of the common American landscapes. In particular, this is where Mike's influence started to really influence me. He identified this project, New Topographics, on the right. Frank Goldke's image is part of that project. This is subtitled The Photographs of a Man-Altered Landscape around 1975. One of the first to look at the common landscape of America, exactly around the same time as J.B. Jackson's early work from a disciplinary perspective on the common American landscape as well. Within this context, though, we're also eager to point to work by folks like Jules Allen and Roy DeCarava, Black American photographers whose work was not included in shows like New Topographics, but was equally groundbreaking in its nature. The work also extends from a lineage of designers collaborating directly with photographers. Here, the relationship between design, specifically landscape architecture, social reform and activism, and photography is not new. Many of you know that the American parks system or the American parks movement in the late 19th century actually grew out of social reform efforts, prompted by the photographic work of folks like Jacob Riss and Louis Wicks Hines, who were depicting the kind of state of life in cities at that moment as a way to begin to motivate a more popular groundswelling towards social reform. The parks movement was simply one piece of that. But extending that most recently, we look at the work by James Corner in collaboration with Alex McLean, with Anu Mater and her partner Dilip Takunya, the work of Alan Berger. In both of those cases, they're actually featuring their own photographic work. And finally, with Kate Orff in collaboration with Robert Misrak. Interestingly enough, there's an image of No More Play at the bottom right. This is a book by Michael Maltzahn with photographer Uwan Ban, where, they're looking at a curation of multiple voices that are bringing the work into play. And this is Uwan not doing architectural photography, but really doing photography of city life and street life, very much in the vein of what we're doing. Our project is one where the photographer's eye is most evidently present. My voice and work are layered in, both as a framer and as, but one voice contributing to the general milieu here. The book's organized by 7 chapters, 7 American cities taken west to east, starting in Los Angeles, extending to Galveston, Texas, to St. Louis, Missouri, on to Green Bay, Wisconsin, Ann Arbor, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, and finally, Boston, Massachusetts, all interspersed by occasional maps that speak to the scale and combination of landscape, infrastructural, and urban systems, and artifacts from the world of practice. This then enriched and informed by 5 collaborating writers that take on issues of the day, politics, climate, social activism, even touching on issues of COVID and wildlife in the city, as well as excerpts from literary and multidisciplinary writers and members of the public. My role is much more as was the recipe maker or the cook of this very thick and rich stew. Here I'm just stirring the pot, adding ingredients along the way that are alternately brought to the fore. They emerge individually and in combination to create a sumptuous meal that expresses different elements of its making, all depending on where you might first dip your spoon. But the project really starts with Mike and his camera, both unfamiliar with the work of design, but laser focused on the people and places that constitute contemporary America. I came across Mike's work one Sunday morning, where I discovered this image in the New York Times and was completely compelled through this work, which was a collaboration with a friend and colleague of his, about the way in which he was very straightforwardly, but in some cases humorously, depicting everyday life, in this case, in Walmart parking lots in the American South, where you're allowed to park and camp overnight. As I began to explore the work, I discovered these two projects on the right, Wild Roots, beautiful but challenging landscape, a project with nuance that captures the joys and grittiness and textures and intimacies of living with others off-grid, and Mike will talk about that in a moment, as well as the project on the left, Stars and Bars, an unapologetic, non-politicized look at Confederate life in the deep American South for a Middle Eastern news outlet. With that, I'm going to hand it off to Mike, and he can tell you a little bit about his own experiences and perspectives and how he began to attack the project at hand. All right, Mike, I'm going to give you a remote control and we'll see if this works.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And as we're doing that, I'll just take the opportunity to thank everyone again for being here. And I'm going to be getting started by giving a little bit of context of who I am as a photographer and talking about not so much my assignment work, which Chris has alluded to here a bit, but more about my personal projects. I always have, at any given time, long-form documentary projects that I take on that aren't for any particular publication. It's more just my own personal exploration into topics that I'm interested in and that are personal to me, or at least they become personal. So this is Wild Roots that Chris mentioned. It's a kind of a primitivist, off-the-grid, intentional community living in the woods in Western North Carolina. As I go through these projects, you'll kind of, and then as we get into Mise-en-Scène, we'll start to talk about how some of these approaches kind of carry over into that work. But this is a project that I started just because I was interested in, and I became very interested in how the people are interacting with the landscape. And of course, the landscape provides a really important context to this work. But really, the process of making this work was probably the most transformative experience of my entire life. After spending over the course of about 7 years on and off, I was spending a lot of time there. And during that time, I changed a lot about my own life based on the things that I was learning, the skills I was learning, the knowledge, and also the philosophy that I was learning from the people there. And so this is a case of kind of full immersion leading to a really fundamental shift in the way I live my life to this day. Whereas this body of work, which overlaps in time period, all of these personal projects do. Each of them is 7 to 10 year projects, but some of that time overlaps. And this one is called The Kids of Hate and Love. And this is about the subculture of skateboarders. And so this is kind of me taking a look at my own life before I got into photography, because I got into photography after about 10 years of being just fully immersed in skateboarding culture. That was kind of my whole life. And I decided once I got into documentary photography, that would be a really good starting place as a way of sort of self-examination, looking at the culture that had shaped my life in so many ways, and seeing myself in the people that I was photographing, who are all close friends of mine that I've known for a long time. And again, like the Wild Roots project, landscape is really important to this work, but in this case, it's urban landscape and looking at how skateboarders interact with and see the urban landscape. And last, this project is still kind of in progress, currently calling it Sky People, but it explores the socioeconomic dynamics of the Caribbean cruise industry. And really, it's kind of look at the lasting legacy of colonialism and how colonialism continues to shape the existence for all of us, particularly in the Caribbean. But I intend with the project to really zoom out and not talk just about capitalism, but what not just colonialism, but what colonialism has led to, which is the system of capitalism that continues to exploit, and it's all kind of tied back to this colonial history. And if you go one layer deeper with this work, it's really about disconnection. And in a way, it's a response to like the work like Wild Roots, which is all about the effort that myself and a lot of other people are making to recreate a sense of connection with the landscape. Here, I'm kind of depicting an extreme version of disconnection and showing some of the hurdles that put in context the work like Wild Roots, which is trying to undo some of that. With this project, and you'll see this carry forward in my collaboration with Chris, is since so much of it is referencing history and things that cannot be photographed necessarily in contemporary scenes, there's a lot of metaphor that's used to allude to the history of these places. And now moving on to this incredible opportunity and collaboration that with Chris Reed. I really cannot emphasize enough that throughout the course of this collaboration, I've been so grateful from the very beginning to be part of this project. It's been an incredible experience, but I didn't really realize until I held the book in my hand, and even more so when I started to hear the reaction of other people when the book was released, is when I started to actually realize what the book is doing and how, and I give full credit to Chris on this because I think it was his vision, and just the importance of collaborative nature in making a body of work, and particularly collaborating outside of your field or your discipline. I think, that's really what makes this project special. I think myself as a photographer, I feel like I kind of live within certain bubbles. The way things are done within kind of the bubble of art documentary photography can be very rigid, and I can find it very frustrating at times. And the fact that this book doesn't really fit neatly into my bubble, and I don't think it quite fits neatly into Chris's bubbles either, I really, really appreciate that about it. And as Chris set up in the introduction, it kind of opens it up to a broader audience. And not only that, the people who are within our disciplines who are seeing this, I think it stretches them and pushes them to think a little bit more broadly or differently from how we generally do in the worlds that we occupy. And I think that's the nature of true collaboration, for each individual involved to have full autonomy and creative control. And I really did not realize how much I was craving that cross-disciplinary conversation until it happened, and I realized how powerful that can be. So I think the book is doing some really important stuff, and I give absolute credit to Chris on that. I did my part the best I could, but it really the vision and the idea of collaborating and bringing all these voices together, tip of the hat to Chris on that. So I wanted to talk about my process a bit in making this work. And it's interesting because the process really changed throughout the time we spent. It was, a year and a half or 2 years of making this work. So where we started and where we ended, I think were very different. And where we started, I don't think either of us really knew exactly where we were going, or speaking for myself, I certainly didn't. I didn't know exactly what we were doing, but we had a kind of a simple starting point, which was we knew what cities we were going to work in, and we just kind of got started by having a lot of conversations. Chris and I either would talk on the phone, or in some cases we would actually walk and talk together in the cities, like starting in Boston, which is where Chris lives and works. We would start by honing in on some Stoss specific sites. And from there, we kind of zoom out farther and farther to encompass broader and broader contexts that start with the concerns of the project and end up kind of looking at the concerns of the city as a whole. And I'm showing this image because this is actually the first image that I made for the entire project. And I mean, literally possibly the first frame that came out of my camera while working on it. And this was actually while we were walking to a Stoss site. And at that time, this is, you know, as I said, the very, very beginning, I kind of thought we were going to be focusing more specifically on the Stoss site. So when I made this picture, I didn't know that I was making a picture for the project. I just thought it was interesting and saw a composition there that I liked, and I made a picture more as kind of a, you know, hold on a second, I want to take this picture while we're on our way to go actually do the thing. But it turned out that this image and many others like it provided a really interesting context, especially for the Boston chapter, which is so much about the tension between old and new, both culturally and ecologically. So this ended up being, I think, a pivotal image in the project. And so as we're moving forward and figuring out our kind of dance back and forth and how we're working together, I kind of thought of it as like an Easter egg hunt, or I'm kind of like a kid on Easter morning, walking around looking for Easter eggs, and Chris was kind of like my dad, where, you know, he didn't want to tell me too specifically exactly where to look or what I'm looking for, but he would say, maybe, you know, check out this general area, you might find something interesting over there, and I would take that prompt and I would go. And this is a perfect example of that, where we were working around the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston, which is a museum where Stoss designed this beautiful corridor and the landscape around it. It's a glass corridor. And while I was photographing around the area, Chris suggested that I go down and spend some time along the river that runs adjacent to the museum. And I did, and I made this image and many others, and I found it to be really visual and fruitful. But then after that, returning back to the site, and this is the next spread in the book, you can see the image on the right is the corridor that they designed. And I had this kind of aha moment where I see this child in the corridor, and I saw the direct connection between the river and the corridor. And it was this moment that I carried with me throughout the project from that day forward, where it was kind of this this Easter egg, where it was a moment of discovery, and that really was the entire process, was just looking for these moments of discovery, these aha moments. And Krista, I think, did a great job of kind of guiding me toward those in the beginning, and then of course later on I was able to find more of those on my own. And so as I'm exploring through these cities, I'm thinking about these conversations I've had with Chris, and particularly some of the themes that come up over and over in the conversations. Like one that you'll hear Chris talk about more in a moment is the idea of reappropriation, or people using a design space in ways that were not necessarily anticipated, or what the thing was designed for, and kind of people making space in that way of creating space for themselves and improvising within space. And so, you know, on the left, you're seeing examples of how I'm looking for that. And then on the image on the right is a bench that is at Harvard, and this is designed by Stoss. And you're kind of seeing how in the Stoss design process, and of course he'll talk more about this, but you're seeing the kind of anticipation of that improvisation and designing for different body types and different uses of the space. And then some of my greatest joys in the project were to kind of find ways of understanding how Chris sees the city and is looking and thinking about his work in relationship to the urban landscape. And then also thinking about my own interests and the things that were drawing my attention. So when Chris started talking about this idea of reappropriation of design spaces, of course, the first thing that jumps to my mind is skateboarding. And I knew some skateboarders in LA, so I met up with one here. And the LA chapter in particular is very much leans on, the conversation is very much about the infrastructure. So we found a great location to show how, skateboarders are improvising within this city of infrastructure. And, so obviously that's kind of me bringing forward some of my personal work into this project. And this is another example of that. You're seeing a similar sort of strategy that I alluded to with the Sky People project. In this case, the idea of the project, and really Stoss as a practice, there's such a consideration of time. And there's this challenge of, photography is a two-dimensional medium and we're making images in a fraction of a second. But Stoss and this urbanism type of consideration is very much four-dimensional. You're thinking of three-dimensional space, but equally important is the passage of time. And how do you allude to the passage of time when you're only shooting in a fraction of a second? So I was looking for these frames that kind of spoke to things evolving and changing in these spaces and who's being left behind. And when you look at the work that Stoss does in cities like Boston and Galveston, we're talking about ecological shifts, sea level rises. They're thinking 80 to 100 years into the future. And projects like the Brickline Greenway in St. Louis is very much engaged with the history of the city, looking at hundreds of years of very tense and difficult history that they're kind of bringing up those conversations. So I wanted to find a way to address some of those issues with the images. So here is in East Boston, and in lieu of being there during like a storm surge, how do you speak to this slow thing that's happening with sea level rise? It's really going to change the face of this and many other cities. And here I felt like the movement of the duck coming up into the parking lot kind of helped evoke this idea of the unknown future of the sea level rise. And here again in Galveston, Texas, utilizing just the visual effect of the fog, creating an effect of kind of this disappearing line of houses, which is a very real consideration. How much longer are these houses going to be able to exist right here on the front lines of climate change? And to speak a little bit more generally about how I make work in this project and in others, is really my approach is all about full immersion, putting myself in a space, trying to be as present as I possibly can, feel what there is to feel, see what there is to see, hear what there is to hear, experience the place, experience people. And I think the closer I can get to the emotional resonance of feeling what a space is, the closer I can bring the viewer. So, there's kind of these tiers of things get kind of a little bit farther from reality with each layer. And I try to get myself as close to as I can to that sense of the reality of what I feel and see in a place, so that I can then pass that on to the viewer. Equally important for me is to always enter spaces that I'm not familiar with absolute vulnerability and openness. So my practice is just to take down all walls, emotional or otherwise, and let whatever comes in come in, and the good or the bad. And I find that it's mostly good. And that's the way that I try to kind of make connections and interact with people. I think the most important part, and I believe that this goes for photography as well as design, and really probably any practice where you're an outsider coming into a community that's not your own, is humility. And humility for me means no amount of research means you know the story, or that is not a stand-in for lived experience. So to me, it's just about talking to the people that live there, asking them how they want their story told, letting them tell me their story, and then using that as kind of a starting point to inform myself rather than any sense of predetermined narrative before I enter. And because this project for me, I live in a very rural area. I spend a lot of time in the woods. I spend very little time in cities. So the part that was, I think, most fun and joyful for me was that I had a genuine sense of curiosity throughout this entire project. And that was really my MO on a daily basis as I would go out to shoot, was just to look around. If something made me wonder, I'd walk toward that. And that was kind of the formula for almost all of the images. But it's actually just as important for me to not necessarily satisfy the curiosity of the viewer. I think an image that asks questions is a lot more interesting than an image that answers the question. So this image, for example, I know what happened directly after this moment. This fisherman just caught this fish. He either threw it back into the ocean, or maybe he threw it to the bird, or maybe he took it and put it in his cooler and took it home. But I think it's a much more interesting image because you don't know that. And so you're seeing the tension of this moment and wondering what's going to happen. Another thing that I found particularly joyful in this process was to, as the project took shape and we were kind of figuring out what was and wasn't the project, it just kept on expanding out farther and farther and farther. And I was really just curious to see where the line was, I was kind of playful about that. I would go out and make images and just kind of kept waiting for Chris to rein me in and say, like, well, what the hell do portraits of llamas have to do with anything? But that moment never happened. And no matter what I photographed or how I photographed it, it was kind of always embraced. And often, or I would say in each case, we were able to find a way to take, no matter how far out we went on a tangent, we could kind of rope it back in and make it relevant, even specifically to the design practice. And here, the llamas were in Ann Arbor, Michigan, which is also the site of this University of Michigan site that Stoss designed the quad. And just this textural relationship between this luscious grass and the llamas, I think kind of helped to situate the site, as well as giving it the more rural context, which sets it apart from the other cities that led up to this in the book. So the first half of the book, you're not seeing any finished design work by Stoss. So it's kind of all about context and looking at the broader issues in these cities. You are seeing drawings, and it's continuously tied back to the practice, but you're not actually seeing the design work until you get about halfway through the book. And there's these two chapters, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Green Bay, Wisconsin. And I think it's kind of a pivot point in the book where it all starts to kind of tie back in. And now you're seeing these direct relationships between my work and Chris's work, and you're seeing direct relationships between Chris's work and the surrounding landscape. And those tie-ins aren't always like really straightforward or literal. But here, this pairing to me is more about sort of an energy and a tone that, you get the sense that the image on the left and the image on the right are kind of the same stuff, if that makes sense. I feel like they kind of feel like they're related in some kind of deeper way, and they absolutely are. And within these designed landscapes, it was again about this full immersion of this interesting push and pull between going out to the surrounding landscape and then in very deep to these textural details, and photographing the objects that make up this design work in a similar way to how I photograph people and do portraiture. And you continue to see this push and pull where, here we're seeing a detail of a bench at the site. juxtaposed against a scene in the community that gives a sense of the personality of the place and also contextualizes and situates the project work within the broader landscape. And now, to close out, I just wanted to go through a sequence of the book exactly as it is. This is from the first chapter, which is Los Angeles, California. And I wanted to kind of walk through as a way of talking about, I've mostly up to this point been talking about my process of making the work, but that was just kind of this like broad gathering process. And there was thousands and thousands of images gathered. And then where the project really took shape was the editing process and the design and the layout. And that happened over the course of a year and a half or so after the images were done being made. And so I wanted to talk through that thought process a little bit of how we laid things out. So I'm just going to walk through the images. So starting with this one, and then we move into this spread. And immediately you're going to see that we're trying to kind of relate the previous spread in this one because you're seeing this kind of circle motif of repeating patterns. And also there's an excerpt written here, which I have a copy of the book here with me, and I'm going to read this excerpt. This is one that I wrote, and it's about the image on the previous page. LA is the land of constructs. While many real struggles exist within this complex city, just as many are fabricated by a society obsessed with perfection. The image of the sculpted round tree in a modest front yard speaks to the futility of this pursuit for most. The white picket fence, the universal symbol of middle-class assimilation, paint chipping from its surface. Shoots of new growth rebelliously defy the tended perfection of the manicured tree. Control and chaos in a constant struggle, all reflecting our own self-worth and social standing for all the world to see. So that kind of idea, I think, carries over into this spread, especially the control and chaos idea. And in this case, we're seeing the human relationship in relation to this idea of control or intentionality, and that's where design comes in. And this is actually a Stoss employee at a construction site in LA, where at Venice High School, where their designs are being implemented. Whereas the image on the right, I was really interested in the relationship between the barbed wire and the cactus and how they're both kind of implementing the same defense strategy, and how you're seeing the relationship between the plants and the human engineering and design. And then here again, carrying forward to one of the Stoss technical drawings, I'm sure Chris could tell you a whole lot more about this than I could, and probably many of you could tell me more about this than I could, but this is directly related to the previous spread. Again, you're seeing the circles repeating, and that's because this is actually the same site as the left image on the previous spread. But again, kind of getting into the idea of the intentionality in the landscape. And then here, we're still kind of playing on this control and chaos idea, but to me, this juxtaposition is kind of more about the landscape on the left feels so incredibly human to me. The rigidity of it. I mean, it kind of, I'm not an expert at all in landscape design, but it just kind of feels like human psychology manifest in landscape. Whereas the image on the right is sort of this edge space where it's still clearly shaped by human activity, but you're starting to see this wildness creep back in. And so and on the right, far right, you can barely see the LA landscape in the background. So these hints of the tension between the wild and the human landscapes. And then in this juxtaposition, it's sort of the same thing in reverse, where the image on the left, the shape of this tree in contrast to the shape of the zigzagging land, the hillside. This is the most kind of wild or natural image you'll see in the entire LA chapter. And to me, it was just about celebrating the incredible, beautiful plant life in this arid LA landscape. Whereas the image on the right is again showing the tension of these in-between spaces. You're seeing, this is the LA River, and you're seeing, the existence of wildlife and plants along this this embankment. But if you look closely, you're also seeing trash scattered throughout the scene. And in the background, you're getting hints at this tremendous infrastructure that it takes to make a city like LA work. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Chris.
Great. I mean, Mike's quite modest about his role and the importance of his role in the work, but in so many ways, I mean, you can see from the richness and depth of the photography how important it is and how central it is to really the work of the book. But in many ways, it was this multi-year journey of mutual learning and learning new ways of seeing places that were very familiar to me on the one hand, but sometimes seeing them through new eyes, and sometimes discovering new aspects and new places within those cities that I didn't even know existed. And so the way that Mike was able to open up my own eyes was really important. I think you also get a sense from the way that Mike was traversing the book that there are many, many possible through lines, many journeys you could take through the book yourself, whether you go in order or find your own. And what I want to do just to kind of end the presentation is to talk about 3 through lines that are in some ways directly related to the thinking behind some of the work and the practice, but in many ways still stand in for the bigger issues that we're all encountering. So the first one is sociability and human behavior, this interest in the unself-conscious ways in which we encounter the world, perhaps reappropriated, as Mike says, for our own desires. Kids are especially good at this, and you're looking at Roy DeCarava's image here. Here in these cityscapes, there are joys and tensions, people just simply going about their daily business, and how all of these emotions, tensions, joys play out in the public realm against the backdrop of the change that's happening. Here it's just people doing the things they do, sometimes in very unexpected places, but they all illustrate the ways in which we adapt to the conditions around us, put them to unintended use to suit our purposes. And this is what is happening in Herman Hertzberger's photos of the 2 ladies to the right, lunching in front of the cafe, choosing to sit sandwiched between 2 parked cars rather than in the cafe itself. It's also what the folks in the left image are doing in spite of the intentional neglect and lack of investment they have faced within their environment. Everybody finds their own place in the world. We appropriate the stuff around us and adapt it to our own bodies or the tasks and desires at hand. A lot of this is very much informed by the work of William White. You may know that, The Social Life of small urban spaces. And it's at projects like this at Gierstecker Grove, the University of Michigan, or at the Harvard Science Center Plaza, where choice, diversity, flexibility, and adaptability of designed elements and spaces and the people who will come to inhabit them are critical informants for a place to be conducive to richly changing social and collective uses. At the City Deck in Green Bay, how it is that these design propositions connect to the everyday and the mundane, and also connect between our own imagination and the physical world. How do we make connections to the celebratory, the collective, even as we have our own very personal and intimate moments within it? Our work is often just a prompt encouraging people to act out their lives while also leaving room for the unanticipated, the unexpected, things we can't imagine, but others can, and those things that are simply beyond our control. Second, the intermingling of urbanization and environmental processes. You're looking at an image of the place I grew up, a tidal river and estuary, the center of an active harbor, and yet this scrappy abandoned landscape along a monolithic piece of infrastructure. When I was here as a kid, I felt at the center of it all, but worlds apart. Years later, I learned that the same hurricane dike that I used to walk to the island contributed to the slow poisoning of this harbor and the river mouth. And so here I'm finding, and in other places, a confluence of work and recreation, ecology and infrastructure, and now environmental crisis at the heart of the city, as well as the challenges of industrialization and infrastructural ambition, making these places caught up in some of the same struggles faced by many cities around the globe. In Galveston, these tensions between environmental impact, people trying to just get by, struggles for existence. Here you see economic and social and urban and biological dissonance, a sense of impending doom, a confluence of risk and cost amidst people tending to day-to-day matters and carefree vacationers. Rich, varied, complex, even troublesome starting points, ways we might help imagine new futures around the need to adapt. In LA, a different context entirely, socially, politically, environmentally. Here it's about heat, fire, drought, a loss of diversity. This very much is a city of infrastructure, a city of consumption, where the impact and implication of landscape very powerful and persistent in the heart of cities and as a shaper of city life, operating at a wide range of scales from the individual person to the larger ecosystem. This is where I see landscape and the lives of cities converging. City life, urban infrastructure, social networks, ecological dynamics are together the starting points for our work and for what we try to instigate, initiate, or interact with as we design and program public space projects. They also represent the larger scene within which we work and life itself in the contemporary American city. And yet, even here, Mike reminds us that LA offers something else entirely, the detailed and the discrete, an accumulation of beautiful, textured, even tender moments, opportunities for quiet and personal connection amidst the swirl and energy and scale of things beyond. And third, questions of identity, race, and social justice, who we make cities for, and who has been excluded from these efforts. The struggle for the full rights of all people as equal citizens with just and equitable access to life and all that it offers. These are issues that are sometimes not that far out of view, but they may require a new eye, a strategic turn of perspective, or a somewhat deeper dive into parallel worlds, parallel cities that have been constructed specifically for whites on the left and blacks on the right. And yet through all of this, you see the spirit and persistence of people sharing time, sharing food and laughter, sharing each other. It all raises questions of whose spaces are these? For whom were they made? Who was erased in the making of them? Who is not welcome here? In the words of activist Dee Nichols, how do we cross lines? How do we disrupt the physical, political, social, economic, and racial lines that have been drawn? Who do we design for? In the city of Detroit, a city of hope, a city of resurgence, just starting to find new common grounds, new and emerging landscapes and public realm built around what Dee would call social common denominators, food, social interaction, music, opportunities for joy. All this builds on work that people are doing to transform the cities and the landscapes around them, tapping into art and culture, and to cultivating the land. Here, folks are imagining new futures grounded on new social conditions, new rights to the city, new ways to collectively occupy space and animate urban landscapes, and the work they're doing to rebuild relationships between and among one another, still with a lot of work to do. Just to wrap up, more broadly, the stages on which we work, the actors we engage with, are already in motion when we arrive. Our work begins many acts in. Our appearances are sometimes relatively short. You might think of our work, of all of our work, as understanding the scripts and dialogues as they are playing themselves out, interacting with those on stage and the forces behind the scenes in ways that both respond to and shift what is at work. resetting the trajectory of the play in ways that sometimes reveals what is hidden just beneath the surface, and giving new voice to those who have been off stage. In so many ways, I think the project tries to communicate the hopes and dreams, the struggles and challenges of contemporary life in American cities and urban landscapes to all who will look and listen closely. And with that, I'll say thanks so much. And I want to pass it back to Henry, who's going to lead us in some discussion and question and answer. Looking forward to hearing your reactions and thoughts. Thank you.
Kia ora, guys. Thanks so much for that. That was beautiful and pretty fascinating. It's really interesting. I guess perhaps a lot of the time as landscape architects, our kind of relationship with photography is at the start and then again at the end, isn't it? And when we do that at the end, we're thinking about kind of our project and the spaces and not so much the people and the process that's gone on. So I think it's really compelling to see the sort of interaction of the art of photography and the art of design kind of woven together. I think we've only got a couple of minutes for questions, but I think and one I've got here, which was I guess on my mind too, is just perhaps whether both of you could expand a little bit on perhaps how this collaboration and project has perhaps informed your own work, subsequent to kind of going on this little journey.
Mike, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I would say there's been a profound shift for me, because I realized through this project and the conversations that have resulted from it that I really want to be engaging an audience that's outside of just the world of photography. And this book has done that. And it's really changed the way I think about, especially my personal work, and the kind of venues and the contexts in which that's shared and the ways that I set that work up or contextualize it. So I've totally kind of scrapped some of my ideas that I had for projects and books that I was planning on doing kind of immediately following this one. And just gone back to the drawing board and thought about how I can bring in more voices and make it more a collaborative process, kind of following in the tone of what Chris and I did with this project.
You know, it's funny, early on, Mike usually tells the story. By the way, I continue to be offended when Mike refers to me as his father in this Easter egg hunt, because I know I'm older than he is, but I just don't feel I'm that much older. But there's also a story that Mike usually tells about when I first called him to talk to him, to learn more about his work and perspective, and really to invite him into the project. And one of the first things he said to me was, what did you say? You said something like, I don't do this work. There are people who photograph architecture and landscape and design, and that's not what I do. And I said, yeah, I know. That's exactly why I want you, right? Because I was hoping that he could bring that lens, that eye he has, and the way in which he's really getting into the places and people that he's depicting in those projects, how you begin to understand something really quite deep, quite nuanced, sometimes very material in the work, and the way in which that could, in some ways reflect our own interests in the everyday and our own interests in this idea that what we as designers are doing is catalytic in a way. It's not the end product. The end product is how these spaces will evolve over time, whether that's through hydrology or ecological session, or simply through the way people start to inhabit and appropriate those spaces, right? It's about the life that's produced in these spaces. For me, it's been an incredibly rich journey. I mean, again, this idea of seeing spaces that I thought I knew through new eyes, opening up new dimensions, and sometimes just discovering aspects of these places that I didn't know before, and frankly might surprise some of the people who live in these cities. And I think that kind of outsider's perspective is as valuable as some of the insider perspectives that you get from folks on the ground.
That's great. Thanks, guys, again. I think we're kind of out of time, and I can see people are sort of dropping off. So look, I just wanted to thank you guys again for making the time to talk to us and sharing your beautiful work. I've just got a few kind of messages, I guess, to run through here. Obviously, thanks again to Streetscape for letting us put these events on for everyone. I hope everyone's enjoying them. I just have to shout out a little bit. We've got in June coming up, we've got a Matariki themed webinar. And also coming up in July on the 29th, we have Margot Long joining us from Vancouver in Canada. It's going to speak about making meaningful change through a value-driven design process. And hopefully everyone's also aware that we've got our conference coming up 11th to 13th of October later this year. So we're now that we're kind of out of COVID, we're boxing on with that. So we're looking forward to seeing everyone later on. Get your tickets, which early bird tickets are out now, but ending soon. So encourage everyone to go and sign up for that. You can see all the details on the website. So look, thanks again, everyone, for joining us. It's been great to see a lot of people on the call. Thanks again, Chris and Mike, and enjoy your weekend, everyone. Ka kite.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Henry.
Really appreciate it. Thanks.